My name is Miguel Barbitsky. I'm an associate research scientist at the Division of Nephrology, Department of Medicine, Columbia University, and I welcome you to this CAIRIBU Community Arctics Forum. Today's topic is communicating science and stakeholder engagement. Our first speaker is Dr. Betty Chewning. Dr. Chewning is a professor in the School of Pharmacy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She went to the University of Chicago as an undergraduate and completed a PhD in education psychology and a postdoctoral program in industrial engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her long-term research interests have addressed the patient perspective and comparative effectiveness to improve patient and healthcare provider communication and impact on patient outcomes. She has a long history of stakeholder engagement in research involving patients, inner-city adolescents, and tribal communities. She has been funded as a principal investigator and a co-investigator over many years by multiple NIH institutes, including the National Institute of Aging, the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. She has several multiple boards and scientific review panels. In 2020, Dr. Chewning received the Paul R. Dawson Award for Excellence in Patient Care Research from the American Association of Colleges of Pharmacy. So we welcome Dr. Chewning to this series of talks.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. So learning objectives, why should we do stakeholder engagement? I mean, it does take some time and effort to do it well. I'd like to also talk a little bit about how the process of entering communities once we decide we want to do stakeholder engagement, because that's not the easiest thing sometimes to do. And then give a few types and process examples of stakeholder engagement from my own research that I think will reinforce the importance of doing it, why it's worth doing it. And then this is one of my bottom line things is that we all need to commit to leaving a community better than it was as a result of the participation. So many reasons for stakeholder engagement. Part of it is you look within your own career and see where you are. And you will find, if you're more toward the beginning, that the smaller preparatory study, your stakeholder engagement can help you with even framing your questions that you want to do, your research questions, what kind of data you want to collect, all of this. Stakeholders can be really helpful with that. Pilot studies, again, they can be helpful with nuts and bolts kinds of issues, everything from recruitment to analysis, to be perfectly honest. Major PCORI NIH study, if you're at that point in your career, I bet some of you are, you maybe know a whole lot already about stakeholder engagement. Then you probably do know it really helps with the execution of your research and thinking about the implementation and dissemination. They can be people from the community can be extremely helpful about that. Basically, stakeholder engagement, in my experience, brings you expertise that you really desperately need because we simply don't know enough. And I have here a list of some of the things that stakeholders can help with. That's obvious that we can get that kind of help, but also I think it's important to know that actually doing stakeholder engagement is so important for showing respect to a group that are the targets of our studies, and is going to greatly increase buy-in with their help in teaching us how we can do that. There's this term, nothing for us without us. What we're doing with stakeholder engagement is we're saying, hey, we want you in, we want your help. We promise we're going to listen. And as we have been talking about, many grant funders now require stakeholder engagement is another reason, if we didn't have enough already, to be doing it. And it takes so many forms. Oh my gosh. A lot depends on how much money you have, and what your time is for getting stakeholder engagement. But I want to tell you, you don't have to do the highfalutin, huge stakeholder engagement processes. If you can't afford it, it's still something that you can do with just a one-time input, whether it's interviews or one focus group. That's fine. Go for it. Advisory boards that meet regularly throughout the grant cycle are another form, and I have done those kinds of things. Great if you can find existing patient advisory boards versus constructing new groups. So I do want to remind you that if one of the things you would be wise to do is to find out from your healthcare colleagues and community groups, what are the existing advisory boards, and can you get on their docket on a semi-regular basis? That is fine. Involving community leaders, patients, caregivers as part of your investigative team is another approach to this. And I have been seeing more of that as well. So all of those are possibilities. I've been involved with the blended stakeholder advisory groups, which I'm going to talk with you about a little bit later. But I just want you to know that I've been doing those now both on Zoom as well as my earlier face-to-face. So I think what we're learning is that there are so many ways to do our blended, that is multi-rolled kinds of groups, that the technology is actually helping us. We can put people into different rooms. You know, if we want to have subgroups, we can keep them together for part of the meeting. So just to reinforce that as well. Well, who can be stakeholders? It's really broad. And these are just, I made a quick list this morning, honestly. I you know, people with the issue or the condition being studied. I've had caregivers of adults. Caregivers are wonderful to have on these. Parents of children with type 1 diabetes. I've had sexually active youth from Cabrini Green Public Housing, 12-year-olds. I've had all kinds of healthcare providers, but also I've had administrators. It's been terrific to have a whole range that way. Community groups and services, Aging Disability Resource Center staff, I've had them on. They've been great. Community leaders, teachers, I didn't put that on. Elders, I've done a lot of work with American Indian groups, and I've had elders, and then children, which I just want to mention because you might not think of them. Except I'm younger than the 12-year-olds I've had down to age 8, and they have been terrific. So there's a lot of people of all kinds who can be helpful to us. So you want to think a lot about a group you hope to partner with in research. And so I have been encouraging people to think about before they begin, ways to understand more about them. You know, you can do that by talking to acquaintances within the group, you know, just informal conversations with providers, whoever would be representative of that group. If you can get an in to talk with somebody before you make that next step, it can be really helpful. Finding out strengths, the weaknesses, opportunities, and the threats as perceived by that group just a bit before you actually engage them can help you. If you can find out leaders, informal leaders or formal leaders, and then what that community is likely to think of as their assets. Quite often, the groups that we study, we think in terms of their needs. But what I want to encourage is for everybody to think about their strengths and their assets and their resources that can be built on. So finding that out. And that leads you to who are stakeholders that you can approach. Again, how can I leave this community better than I found it? I mean, always be asking that question. All of this, you know, informs how you go about this process then. One of the things I wanted to mention about community leaders, again, informal or not, is what you're looking for are some trusted messengers who can share information about your project with others in the community, so that if you can find those trusted messengers, it can be a powerful thing. I have learned the hard way, I have to say, not to think of yourself as any kind of savior, but rather to really understand they're helping you, and that what you're doing is you're co-creating together. And the other thing that I have taken seriously is I have taken to trying to help members of the community that I'm working with, if they're interested, if there's some people who are interested, some grant writing skills so that they can carry on doing that. after our grant is over in other ways. And I try very hard to hire from within the community if I have the resources to do that, and if there are people who can play those roles. So some ways that I've ended up in different kinds of communities, for those of you who are interested in community-based participatory research, the Great Lakes Intertribal Council here in Wisconsin invited me to write an NICHD grant with them. And that ended up really working out well, because they then reached out on my behalf to tribal clinic directors to discuss the possible grant. So it's like, once you get an in, and then you sort of snowball your way from there, it can be really powerful. So then the two tribal clinic directors identified elders who were interested in working with us. And all of that really shaped the grant that ultimately got the NICHD funding. Another thing that happened was we had two hospitals who were competing about diabetes care, one in Madison, one in Milwaukee. But what we did was we talked with administrators, and they seemed open to collaborating on a grant. And they were fantastic. We ended up working with them and developing advisory groups, then having champion clinicians from both advocacy groups for juvenile diabetes that were in the community. And then, as I have here, you can see we had 5 different advisory groups going on that particular grant, generated from the involvement of 2 competing hospitals. So that was I think a really interesting example of where collaboration was unexpected but possible if you explored it. Another thing that happened is I just wanted to mention, through fellow researchers, you can enter. In my case, there was a researcher that was working with Cabrini Green Public Housing Clinics in Chicago with sexually active 12-year-olds. And she introduced me to clinic staff that were located in a little building that was right next to Cabrini Green. The clinic got excited about what I wanted to do, which was develop a contraceptive decision aid for sexually active young people on computer. So anyway, they helped me identify young women who could serve on an advisory committee. And then what happened was that the kids got really excited. So then we started out with probably about 6 kids, and we ended up with about, 14. It kept getting bigger and bigger. I would just meet with them monthly, and I would gather what they wanted me to do. I basically did what they told me to do with regard to development of this contraceptive decision aid. And I am so proud of the work that came out of that. We were decades ahead of the field for graphic presentation of risk. In this case, the risk was applied to the risk of getting pregnant with different contraceptives used. But they wanted graphic representation. I tried out lots of different ways. They told me exactly what they wanted. And Mayo Clinic now uses that way in talking about risks associated with its medications. So, and I wanted to just say, they're the only group who's ever applauded my work each visit. They were very sweet to me. I would show them on the computer what I had done, then they would applaud. And I was like, oh my God. So, yeah, and they told me that I looked a lot like one of the soap opera actresses who died of AIDS. So it was a really fun, the whole thing was fun. So I want to reinforce that group itself was extremely diverse. Actually, they were all African American, but they had very different experiences. And of course, any community consists of people that have commonalities, but even that little group, no, the members weren't all the same. And I did grow to appreciate differences, and found it an important part of my listening to really try to be aware of that in terms of their experience, their willingness to use a condom, for example, or not, their willingness to use pills or not. They really differed a lot. So when I was talking earlier about all of the advisory committees that we had for this one, it was a PCORI study that we were doing, an intervention study. we ended up having, as I had mentioned, several different stakeholder advisory groups, and each of these were composed of people from different, either Milwaukee or Madison, different age groups. And then we had the external advisory board, which had a full complement of different roles in it. What I wanted to, I guess, emphasize more than anything else with this is that they each gave us unique input. And so that question of what kind of stakeholder can be most helpful to you to answer your questions as they're emerging in the cycle of the grant, across the cycle of the grant, is really worth revisiting throughout the grant, because it may be that you need to add a different kind of stakeholder voice at different times. This was a picture of our external advisory board. I didn't mention that we also had a dog on the advisory board. The dog had an important function. Everybody loved that dog. And so everybody wanted to be sitting next to that dog. But the dog was a working dog, helping to detect if one of our members was in distress, had been trained basically to tell if there was, if her blood sugar was at a dangerous level at any time. So, but here you see the kids, you see staff, you see administrators, you see clinicians, and everybody was respectful of one another. It was really wonderful. That didn't happen without planning. We did a lot of planning, and it usually took 1 to 2 meetings with the PI, 2 to 3 meetings with the facilitators to get to the point of being clear what we wanted to have happen in the meeting. I wanted to just mention the selection of questions, because this is part of making sure you're getting what you need from your stakeholder group that makes them valuable. Why are they valuable? Well, you have to have a question to pose that you can do something about, that fits into the timing of the cycle of your grant. So you've got to anticipate what's the stuff coming up that you're going to have to make decisions about. Those are the kinds of questions to pose. You may think that's perfectly obvious. In a way it is, but if you're off on your timing, on your, how your groups align with the decisions you're making, that's a problem. The other thing that I wanted to say is that we were very careful not to raise questions that we would have to go back to IRB if we got an answer that we didn't like. So there were some things that we chose not to ask, but generally we found that we could ask almost anything that we thought was really an important thing to get the feedback on. But we did always ask ourselves, can we implement what they tell us? Because that was what we wanted to be able to say, that we would use what they had to say. So these are just some examples, again, of why it was so important to have the stakeholders. This might, I don't know if anybody else has ever had this challenge, but in the pilot, we discovered that the people who were assigned to the control group they didn't want to be in the study after they found out that they'd been assigned to be in the control group. They wanted to get the intervention. And so we knew we had a problem with that. So we thought, well, we're gonna ask our advisory group about this issue. How do we discuss randomization? And then I've got a variety of other issues here that you can see were important. But what I want to tell you is they solved that problem for us in probably 5 minutes. One person said, well, just tell people that the computer did it. That's all you have to do. We said, really? They said, well, yeah. Just don't make it sound like you're doing it and there's a choice. Just say the computer did it. So we did. That's exactly what we did. And it worked. It worked. We didn't have people drop out of our control group. We kept them. We got them there and they stayed. It seems like afterwards now, it sort of seems like was that such a big thing? But yes, it was, because otherwise we would not have had the sample, a comparable sample between our control and experimental. They also told us, don't use words like just, like don't say, well, in the control group, you just have blah, 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 because it seemed to devalue it. So we got particular suggestions of wording that made all the difference in the world. So that's just a small example of why they're so valuable. Now, iterative collaboration is key, and I want to really reinforce this because so you engage in this meaningful dialogue about a meaningful question, you generate the feedback, the ideas, and the solutions from their perspective. You get member buy-in and commitment because you're asking them meaningful questions that you tell them you're going to use. So then what would happen is that we would leave these meetings all excited and saying, I don't know if this is going to work, but we're going to try it. And we'd try it out. And oh my gosh, they were always right, it seemed. We'd revise our plans. We would address the issues and implement the solutions. And then we would always report back at the beginning of the next meeting exactly what we had done and what happened as a result. And then we would have these additional questions. So the beginning of each of our meetings was really a success story about the suggestions that had been made. Again, this commit to leaving a community better than it was as a result of participation. I'm sure we all feel that, but I want to tell you that the commitment actually involves sometimes difficult things. And I'm going to just give one example here. Well, I'll start at the bottom. You know, I always try to report ongoing results and explore implications. I just was talking about the changes that we were making in process, you know, in terms of your advisory group. But I also have come back to the community, like school boards or newsletters that are going out to the community, to the community of patients, to say, this is what we have learned so far, or this is where we are, this is what's coming up. And that has been something that has been, I think, appreciated. I always try to thank and give credit publicly to individuals in the community. I've done celebrations with the community. In our Indian group, one of the agendas that we discovered they had was they wish they had more oral history going on. That wasn't going to be part of our project, but I'll tell you, we incorporated that because I knew we could. And so we integrated their agenda into ours, and it ended up being, I think, one of the ways that assured we were not kicked out of those very vulnerable communities. I'm still amazed about what a good relationship we had. The do no harm review data sharing policies is part of a tricky thing that I want to mention that came up in the context for me, especially of the Indian communities, because we were collecting data about adolescent risk behaviors, sexual activity, alcohol and drug use, violence. And it became apparent that this was really stigmatizing and sensitive. And as we went on and saw the results and were sharing it with them, they said, we don't want that to go to NIH. And NIH had funded us. So I took it seriously. And I reported to NIH what was going on. We brought people from the tribe, researchers, had a major presentation at NIH about the issue, the reasons, the concerns, and they gave us permission not to store our NIH data there and to agree with the restrictions of protecting even the ethnic identity of respondents in some of the research we were doing, which otherwise it would have been African-American versus American Indian. Wisconsin was the only site with the Indian reservations. And so that was why it had become an issue. So all I'm wanting to suggest is that there are times when it's not always easy, but I think it's important to try. I wanted to give you links to a couple of websites. One is ours here at the University of Wisconsin, which just keeps growing. And the other is my good friend Dan Mullins at University of Maryland. His group is fantastic, and I want to give a shout out for all of his work. So that patients.umaryland.edu is really good on stakeholder engagement, and I encourage you to take a look at that. So questions, and I don't know, should we do questions now, or how would you like to work that?
Miguel, it's up to you.
Yeah, that would be a good moment to ask questions. So thank you, Doctor, for your very illuminating talk. It was really interesting. I have one question so in today's world, social media plays a very important role. So how do you see how can you use or participate in social media in a way that can facilitate your work with stakeholder engagement, and what are some of the benefits and dangers of that?
Social media is such I would hardly say that I'm an expert in social media, so let me say that right at the beginning. But I do think that just in terms of, I was saying that technology is something we've been using. Certainly we've been using Zoom just as we're using it right here. Reddit is do you know about Reddit? I don't know. It's one of those media things that I have students who and I are starting to think more about the value of looking at what people have to say about issues. For example, and I'm just picking one out of the air, antidepressants and side effects, fears about antidepressants, side effects, and people choosing not to take antidepressants after they've been prescribed because of their fear of side effects. Well, I think that social media has the potential to not only give us information about concerns that we can explore, so that's shaping research questions, but I also think it has the possibility that we can use it to feed back information that I think can be helpful. And if I think about the work that I have done with regard, well, a large number of topics, it offers an opportunity social media offers an opportunity to share information that can be helpful for people to weigh and to think about in making their personal decisions. So that's one way I think about it. But may I ask you, Miguel, have you thought about it?
So I really don't participate much on social media, but I see that the world around me uses that all the time, and it's we hear in the news all the problems and dangers of and harm that social media can produce. But at the same time, it's like an unavoidable part of our world. So I think it's important that we as researchers think of ways to find ways to use those tools in a way that is that allow us to reach a wider community, and on the other hand be able to protect that community, and make that forum a welcoming place, and a place that can be, where the content can be moderated at the same time. So I think that's something that's unavoidable. So I think we have to think about how to do that.
I think that would be a really interesting session to hold, and I would like to participate as a learner. But I also, I've thought about this in terms of my work, in terms of facilitating conversations in medication management. What we're talking about doing is much more work around medication management via social media, both creating tapes, creating conversations, creating not just conversations, but that conversations are part of it, role playing with feedback, in order to help people develop skills. I think we can be moving in that direction with social media. I really do.
I also
And
think
then
also,
like, yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
No, I think that also the stakeholders themselves can, educate
Mhm.
us in that sense.
Yes, yeah,
And so that could be,
thank you for that question.
so any other questions for Dr. Chewning? Okay,
I want to
so
say good luck. I want to say good luck to everybody on your stakeholder engagement. Let me know if I can be helpful.
thank you so much.
Mhm.
So, so our next speaker is Dr. Gregory Tasian. Dr. Gregory Tasian is an attending pediatric urologist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and an associate professor of urology and of epidemiology at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He attended the medical school at Baylor College of Medicine, completed a urology residency at the University of California, San Francisco, and completed a pediatric urology fellowship at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He has a Master's of Science degree in neuroscience from Oxford University and a Master of Science in clinical epidemiology from the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on epidemiology and clinical trials in kidney stone disease and applying machine learning to improve understanding of the pathophysiology of prediction of outcomes and identification of therapeutics in children with benign urologic disease. He is the PI of the NIDDK-funded P20 Exploratory Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Benign Urology, which is part of CAIRIBU, and has received more than $8 million from the NIDDK since 2015 for projects related to machine learning to improve patient surgical outcomes, the gut-kidney axis in kidney stone disease, behavioral interventions to decrease stone disease morbidity, identifying risk factors for dehydration in adolescents, and identifying anatomic biomarkers of CKD in children. Dr. Tasian serves on numerous advisory boards and scientific review panels and is on the editorial board of several pediatric and nephrology journals. So we welcome Dr. Tasian to our session.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here and really to just continue the conversation that was started at the beginning of the session. The theme today, and let me know if you can see the slides as I project them. Are they coming through?
Yep.
So it's really to continue this theme of stakeholder engagement. And I want to just really start with three themes. One is partnership. The second is community. And the third is co-production, and how we might be able to change our framework from a investigator-centered research program into one that's truly patient-centered. And in doing so, engage stakeholders, engage patients, engage caregivers as part of that process. And to start out with, I just wanted to start with the traditional conceptual model of how research is both generated in terms of ideas, how it's operationalized, and how it's disseminated. So the traditional model in which we all participated at some point in our career, and most of us still do, is that these ideas are generated by a clinician, they're generated by a researcher, and then you conduct a trial that tests a hypothesis or tests an intervention. And then ultimately, through publication in the peer-reviewed literature, those results are disseminated out and hopefully will have some impact on how care is conducted, and that knowledge generated would improve outcomes. However, what is missing from that is the centrality of the patient voice. And what I wanted to present today is our own experience with patient-centered, patient-prioritized research, and start with the concept of listening to the patients. And I so appreciated that idea of being a learner, because at no point in my career have I learned more than by engaging with patients and their caregivers. And these are some direct quotes from what we call our patient and family partners in a pediatric kidney stone network called PKIDS. And these are just words that they shared with us as we learned from their experiences. And one was, I typically don't get notice before passing a kidney stone. And this makes it difficult when I'm at school. I'm always on edge. I never had surgery before, so I was really nervous. I went home and researched online how kidney stones pass, how the surgery worked, other surgery options, and people's experiences with them. This was after a clinic appointment with a surgeon who had said that this patient needed stone surgery. And then this one I thought was particularly compelling, from a patient who had undergone both shockwave lithotripsy as well as ureteroscopy. And the first experience was, this outcome was that this surgery, that no one would want to repeat. And from the same individual, wow, this experience was so different than my previous one. And that had led to this concept and this conceptual model of having a patient-centered approach, a patient-centered research cycle. And what this does is it places the patient at the center with the research team so that they are co-investigators along with the clinicians and other researchers. And this involves not only the study design, what questions are asked, but how they're asked and how that study is operationalized. And then in the final stage, how those results are disseminated, and really building on that idea of a community, and that you really want to generate results that are impactful to that community and that can be propagated by that community to reach their peers. And I think this is where the good aspects of social media can be really harnessed. So I wanted to provide our experience in the Pediatric Kidney Stone Care Improvement Network, or PKIDS. And this is our mission statement, which we begin every meeting just by reflecting on. And that's to improve outcomes for children with kidney stone disease through collaborative patient-centered research. And the PKIDS is comprised currently of 26 health systems in the United States and Canada. And each one of those health systems are our partners. There are equal partners in both the generation and then ultimately the application of knowledge, so that the results that are generated through this co-production of research would ultimately then be applied back into clinical care, thereby sort of bypassing or incorporating that passive dissemination of knowledge into something that's much more active. And that concept of partnership is reflected in the structure of PKIDS. There is the executive committee, but the core of it is really the engagement core, from which flows our patient and family partners that are equal members to the traditional research model of the clinical centers, the investigators and the clinicians, as well as the biostatisticians and data analysts, all of whom are partners in this network. And I want to expand on that idea of what partnership means and who these stakeholders are. Certainly, as we've learned in the first half hour, that patients and caregivers are those critical partners that should be key stakeholders in a research endeavor. And we know from our own experience that clinicians and researchers can be our stakeholders. But I would also expand it to partners in health insurance and the payers, because if we're talking about ultimately making impactful knowledge, it really depends on how care is administered. And that's why you see industry and health system leaders as part of our stakeholder groups that are really focused on all three phases of study development and implementation, including planning and conducting the study and ultimately disseminating the study results. And I apologize for there must be some timing issues, so I'll try to stay ahead of it. But this is the conceptual model that's simplified as it's applied in PKIDS. And as you can see here, the patient is at the very center of everything we do. We turn to our patient and family partners for guidance, for insight, to learn from them. One, is a question that we're asking important? Two, how do we ask it? And that can be as very specific as, how are questionnaires administered? And then what's the timing of those questionnaires after, for example, surgery? We want to be able to capture the experiences that are most important to them. And then you can see the other components of the organizational structure around this model, in that as you conduct the study, as it's embedded within clinical care, this knowledge is generated. That's where the clinicians, the surgeons are so important, because they're on the front line delivering care, and in the process of doing so, generating knowledge. And then that data is collected, it's organized and analyzed, which involves clinicians and researchers and patients and biostatisticians. And then as that knowledge is generated, it is applied back into care, creating this cycle of learning in which the patient and their caregivers are at the very center. And it never deviates from that centrality of having the patients at the center. And I'm going to pause here to just demonstrate how critically important our patient and family partners are to our research process. And that's from just listening to their voice. So often as clinicians, we are on the speaking end and informing our patients and their caregivers about the disease process, what the therapeutic options are, but not listening, truly listening to what is going through their mind and what their experiences are and why they're important. But in the second paragraph from Anna, who's actually in Milwaukee, she had said that personally getting kidney procedures has given me a lot of anxiety. It's something that always worries me that I'm going to have to do when I get a kidney stone. But what I would want any physician to know is the anxiety of every office visit, not knowing if a new kidney stone is formed or not. It was helpful to have a physician that listened to what did and didn't go well with other procedures in order to feel more comfortable and have the future procedure go well. And I know personally, this really was an eye-opening experience to hear Anna share her experience, because one thing that I've certainly taken for granted is that clinical visit where you share the results of, say, an ultrasound and say, you know, it looks good, or, you know, you have another stone. And to do so sort of divorced from the experience of the patient. And hearing that experience from her own, in her own voice, was transformational, because it changes how we think about what's important and what outcomes we measure in our research studies. So maybe, for example, you know, stone clearance is not the most important thing that we need to think about in surgery, but we need to think about what that experience is from the child's perspective or the adult patient's perspective. And the only way that we can truly know that is by asking the question. So I would say be inquisitive learners as researchers and start with asking the question of the ultimate stakeholder, and that being the population whose research you want to impact. And this is from Hunter, who is a member of our patient family partners. He's 16 years old, and he was featured recently in Urology News. And he had explained why this experience of being a patient family partner is so important. And he said that we have the real life experiences of living with kidney stones and can help provide crucial information that you would only know by living with the condition. And it's so true. So this is the model of how I would say that spectrum of patient engagement, in which you start with these researcher-directed outcomes, and I mentioned stone clearance, residual fragments there, complications, but then moving into patient-reported outcomes, and those being really the experiences of our patients. And those can be captured by any number of different instruments, WISQAL, PROMIS, all of this very exciting work that's going on in this space. And then what I would say is aspirational, and where we need to be moving, is patient prioritized outcomes, where what we need to do to understand what is most important for patients and what reflects their priorities. And I would say that's what we need to model and measure. And in PKIDS, and this is, I think, true for all research, and what I wanted to emphasize here is it's a community. And with all of these diverse stakeholders that are represented, Each brings their own experience, each brings their own unique focus within research and clinical care. And this is just a bubble plot of all of the different areas that are represented by this community from like the investigative side. And when you bring all these people together, that's when new ideas are generated and synergy can come out of this work. So by building a patient-centered community and bringing in all these stakeholders, you can expand the scope of what is possible within this group. And something that has not been discussed to any great deal is the relationship of industry or our private partnerships. And I know there are many issues that have to be discussed in this very complex environment, but I would also say there's opportunities to develop partnerships in a very careful and transparent way that allow you to bring in elements of care along this continuum that would allow you to expand and really operationalize in the real world the knowledge that's generated as part of research. And what you've seen here is just really reflected within kidney stone disease along that spectrum of care, and how each of those points has companies, has groups that produce products that might be sources of investigation. And if you include patients in this question and developing the question, can really develop some impactful studies. And when you change this model of a community that is centered around patients, and all that the knowledge that is generated from that and then applied back into care, you can have a paradigm shift. So over these next 4 slides, I'll show you how individual performance relates with standardization and what might be achieved. So this is our current state in which you have a wide variation of performance among individuals. And if we look to standardize by, say, creating care pathways, we might be able to narrow that deviation, but you're not really shifting any performance. If you look towards improvement without standardization, you may make a shift, but it's going to be a wide distribution with a wide deviation. And if you can do standardized improvements by building on this community and that shared knowledge, you'd be able to shift the bar and keep it narrow. And if you're doing so in a patient-centered way, you are truly going to be able to improve outcomes for your target population. And this is really what is driving all the work that is going on now and in the future. And this is just another demonstration of how this might be visualized. But to bring it home, this is the conceptual model that I would encourage you to think about in your own research, because it goes far beyond comparative effectiveness research and clinical trials. It is very applicable to translational investigation as well as basic science, in just asking the question of patients, what is important and why. That can be your guiding light in every question that's asked. And then I wanted to spend just 2 minutes on where we're going as a network, because this is a very exciting space for us. PCORI is funded in large part by, PKIDS is funded in large part by PCORI, as well as a number of other industry grants. But in the future, it seems very likely that PCORI is going to fund what's called Practical, which is a patient prioritized research agenda, in which we're creating a kidney stone engagement core that would bring us through the process of creating a truly patient prioritized research agenda. And then this core would be posed to implement that agenda. And the community here, and these are our stakeholders, include the PKIDS network, Music Rocks, the OHF, the USDRN, which is funded by NIDDK, the Rock Society, all of whom would contribute stakeholders, including patients, including caregivers, including those vulnerable patients who typically don't have a voice in research, those who have developmental disability, intellectual disability, and we want to have their voices reflected in the work that's done. And this practical framework that would ultimately create at the right-hand side of the screen, this patient prioritized research agenda, is going through 3 phases of elicitation of ideas, refinement of those ideas, and then ultimately the prioritization, and really placing patients at the top of that. So with that, I wanted to conclude that, really high-level overview of patient engagement and building a community of stakeholders, and would be more than happy to answer any questions now. Thank you so much for the kind invitation.
Any questions for Dr. Tasian? Thank you so much for this fascinating talk, Dr. Tasian, and fascinating work. So a few questions. How I would like to know how you actually document. You mentioned centrality of patients' voices. So how is that documented? How is that integrated into the research? How is that information protected also? And if that that information leads to new aims or new goals in your research.
So I'll answer in 2 ways. One, broadly, our patient and family partners are not research participants, they're co-investigators. They're funded co-investigators on every study that we do. And then the second is that, for example, in the current comparative effectiveness trial, the outcomes that are being ascertained were selected by our patient and family partners from a suite of possible options. So that's how I would say that that's documented. It wasn't John Ellison, who's my partner in PKIDS, or me selecting the outcomes. It was our adolescents and caregivers.
And also another question, how so this communication between the investigator or the healthcare provider and the patient that's so central to your approach, in a sense is kind of like an anthropologic endeavor, because in a city like Philadelphia, for example, is so diverse. There are multiple cultures, multiple backgrounds, and so there could be things that can be lost in translation, and there's the person who speaks, the patient, and also the listener who puts their own cultural baggage. And so how do you incorporate that in your approach?
So one of our guiding documents in PKIDS is our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement that is both operational and aspirational. That is at the forefront of every decision we make as a network, both for investigators and the studies that we undertake. So that is number one. Number two is ensuring that the knowledge that we generate is as broadly generalizable as possible. So for our large comparative effectiveness study, we've made every effort to make it available in as many languages as possible. So we just rolled out our Spanish database, which includes all the PROMIS measures, so that we can really represent our patient community. So I think there's both structural ways that are important, as well as very practical ways in the way you implement a study.
So if I may, one more question. How do you perceive the understanding or lack of understanding of your research subjects and the other stakeholders of how the scientific process works?
It's a great question. So all of our patient and family partners go through research training. There's a module called Fireworks. It was developed by one of my colleagues, Amy Kratchman, through a Eugene Washington PCORI Award. And it's really to teach our patient and family partners who don't have a background in research some of the fundamentals of research, so that they feel comfortable and that they have a level seat at the table.
See. Thank you so much. So any other questions?
I have a question. Sorry, I'm a newcomer. Vinaya Bhatia at UW. Dr. Tasian, that was such an inspiring talk. My question for you is kind of in a different set of disease processes in pediatric urology. Specifically, how do you see patient prioritized outcomes affecting the landscape of shared decision-making in our reconstructive procedures? It's daunting. I mean, even getting a true informed consent, with these families is really challenging. I feel like, even with 3D printing and other things that we're trying to do, I really appreciate your insights on how we can do better with all of that.
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I would start with asking the question, of your patients, what information would be helpful to them when they're making these incredibly important decisions. And then just seeking a representative sample that can help inform what next steps you would take. There are some urologists that are very much engaged in this work. Giovanni Dai does a lot of work in the trans community. And I think she would be very eager to engage in some of those conversations and broaden, this type of approach for all types of research.
So thank you so much, Dr. Tasian, Dr. Chewning, and all the participants in this forum. And we hope to see you in our next CAIRIBU Arctic Forum.